Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett, and thank you for joining us today on Market Journal. July traditionally delivers the hottest days of the year. Earlier this week, June attempted to deliver that July heat. Portions of the state felt temperatures climb all the way to 109 degrees on Monday. We'll have more about that weather, which included more severe storms, later in the program with Al Dutcher. But first, late last month, the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced it would be allowing participants in their final year of their contract for the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, to request voluntary termination of their contract. This decision was reached to help address continuing threats to global food security. Participants approved for this one-time voluntary termination will not have to repay rental payments. This is a flexibility implemented this year to help mitigate the global food supply challenges being caused by a number of factors, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Eligible participants should be expecting mail correspondence from their local FSA office regarding further details.
Well, I think it's clear we've got some concerns about food supply worldwide, and the Secretary made a determination just this past week that we needed to give farmers some flexibility in determining what was best to do with their land. We clearly have some shortages that we're trying to address. This changes really nothing in terms of getting an early termination, except that you don't receive a reduction in your payment. The reduction in the payment has been waived if you're coming out of CRP this year, and if you want to start fall planting this year in order to help to try to address that shortage and maybe take advantage of some commodity markets. We don't anticipate that there's going to be a great deal of acres that come out because of this, because these are still highly erodible lands that we put into the CRP program, but we wanted to give that flexibility to farmers so that they can make their own determination on what to do with those acres and see if they could help address this issue that's becoming bigger and bigger. So if you're curious as to whether you're eligible for an early termination, you'll be receiving a letter if you are eligible, and then once you get that, you'll need to go in and visit with your county office to get the paperwork all done.
Since CRP land does not typically have recent history of pesticide or herbicide application, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is encouraging producers to consider organic production. The USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service provides technical and financial assistance to help producers plan and implement conservation practices, including those that work well for organic operations such as pest management and mulching. There are other CRP options, such as the Transitioning Incentives Program, or TIF, available as well. NRCS is also offering a new flexibility option for EQIP and CSP participants who have covering crops included in their existing contracts. Producers and landowners who are eligible can learn more about their options by contacting their local FSA and NRCS at their local USDA Service Center. As we turn our attention now over to the grain markets, the Fed did as expected earlier this week. In a move to tamp inflation, the Federal Reserve raised its key interest rate. Shortly after that announcement, we had the opportunity to catch up with Darin Newsom of Darin Newsom Analysis. I asked Darin about that move and how it would ultimately affect the consumer. Here to discuss the markets now is Darin Newsom. Darin, it's always great to have Market Journal. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me on again, Bryce.
Well, the big news as you and I have this conversation today has to do with interest rates. What can you tell our viewers about what came out this week?
Yeah, the Federal Reserve bumped the Fed funds rate by another 75 basis points. So putting it in that 1.5 to 1.75%. What I like about how Chairman Powell and the rest of the group there at the U.S. Federal Reserve, what they're doing is they get ahead of this. They, basically this has been announced. This has been talked about before the actual announcement comes out. So, we're not throwing the markets into chaos. We're not trying to see how much havoc can be created. It's just, the U.S. Federal Reserve is trying to manage monetary policy, and that's all it really is. That's what they're supposed to do, and that's what it boils down to. So, we saw the expected 75 basis point increase. Now we'll see how the markets react longer term. I don't think it's going to change anything. We haven't made any adjustments to supply and demand. The only other thing that really came out this week was retail sales cracked for the first time. We saw a little bit of a decrease. So, this could be the first sign that we are reaching that consumer tipping point, that pain point where they actually do stop buying quite as much with inflation. But as far as the interest rate goes, needed. It's been needed. I'm not really one of those who's going to say we don't need to be making moves. I think we should have been making moves before. And so, good move on this week, and we'll see how many more we have in the future.
Well, Darin, let's jump into the grain market now. Starting with corn, what are you seeing over in that market right now?
The biggest thing in the corn market to me is the strength of old crop basis. As far as looking at the bar chart National Corn Basis Index, it's gone to about 3.5 cents over July. So we're in overs for the first time in the 2021-22 marketing year. What this tells me is we have an incredibly tight, real supply and demand situation, not the imaginary ones, but the real supply and demand situation is at or near record tight levels. We've got merchandisers really pushing to try to find supplies to meet all three categories of demand, which are feed, ethanol, and exports. While we could start to see those slow down a bit here over the course of the summer, right now they're still red hot, still a lot of demand, and it's a real fight to try to find supply. So the biggest thing in the corn market to me continues to be basis, and we'll see how long that lasts.
Is that a different story at all when it comes to soybeans?
A bit different story. Here, in the soybean market, we are facing a similar situation, similar to, I believe it was what we saw in 2012, 2013, where we're basically just out of soybeans. And so demand could start to be falling off as we speak. Wednesday morning, we saw the first announcement of a small cancellation by unknown destination, something like 3.7 million bushels. I think this is something that we're going to have to get used to. I think we're going to see more of this. I think it's going to be very difficult for merchandisers to find the soybeans to meet the demand that we've already got on the books. So I think we are going to see some cancellations, particularly if we're going to continue to crush at the pace we have been.
To that point, you say there's not enough soybeans to meet the demand right now. I think the producer would be asking, so why aren't prices going even higher than what we see right now? Your thoughts, Darin?
Well, yeah, we've factored this in. I mean, if we look at the national average cash prices, May saw us close, I think, at the second highest national average cash price ever on record, and we haven't fallen off that far here in June. So the pressure that we've been seeing of late. There's a lot of non-commercial selling in the market. Remember, every market's made up of two sides, non-commercial and commercial. Commercials are still bullish. It's still bullish fundamentals. But the non-commercial side, we look at what's happening with the U.S. stock indexes. There's a lot of concern in the investment community as a whole. And so what we're seeing is some of that spillover into commodities, at least some of the commodities, one of them being soybeans, where we've got some long liquidation of the July contract. They know they're going to probably roll out and start buying in November at some point. The August and September are useless contracts. So at some point they're going to slip out there and they're going to start buying some November based on long-term fundamentals. We just haven't seen it yet because there's been no real hurry to get it done.
Mm-hmm. So we've covered corn, covered soybeans. When it comes to wheat, the winter wheat coming out now in the state of Kansas. Talking with you before we hit the record button, seeing those daily updates out of the state of Kansas, and it sounds like, as expected, not a great crop, right?
No, it's going to be a poor crop this year. We've been able to see that in the spreads, basically going back to late last fall, early winter. We knew the crop wasn't going to be very good, and as the combines continue to roll, last report I saw was combines were already up into the central part of the state. You've got yields anywhere from low teens to upper 50s is what's running right now. The interesting thing to me, though, and again, this is not a surprise, but given the drought, we're seeing protein levels going up in the crop. Again, that tends to happen when we've got a drought, and I can't help but think that the hard red spring merchandisers, those up across the northern plains, are going to be getting pretty excited about that. They're going to be looking to buy some of that hard red winter with the higher protein levels because there's not going to be much high protein hard red spring this year. Some in North Dakota, some of the northern plains did not get planted. So they're going to be searching for some of that high protein wheat, obviously going to be interested in some of the hard red winter bushels coming in this harvest.
You mentioned that D-word drought that we've seen impacting, obviously, the winter wheat. As we look at this grain trade, it seems like weather is obviously that big uncertainty that nobody has a crystal ball and can tell us what's going to happen with.
At their core, these markets, production markets, ag production, however far you want to take that out, they're just weather derivatives. And so basically the bottom line, it almost always turns out to be weather. And, as we head into summer here, we've got a sharp break about the Missouri River, where everything west is in some sort of drought. Everything east is okay to actually showing surplus soil moisture. The big question right now has been northwest Iowa. And, here this week, that area did see some pretty good rains. So there's not a lot of concern, at least at this point, east of the Missouri. But we'll see how the summer plays out, because that's what everyone's going to watch. I mean, we have to have big crops this year to start to rebuild these supplies. And if we don't get them, if we get some weather scares, these markets are going to stay volatile.
All right, Darin, the final word is yours this week. What else do you want to add, or any risk management advice you'd like to pass along?
These are profitable levels, and it doesn't matter what market that we're talking about. If we can get some on the books, just offset some of that volatility that we're looking for this summer, it's not a bad thing. And am I wanting to sell absolutely everything? No. But I mean, if we continue to put some on the books at these levels, it's going to be profitable. It's going to be a good sale. No matter what happens in the markets, it's going to be a good sale. So we need to be looking for those opportunities, not just for 2022, but also for 2023.
Thanks to Darin for his time this week. Certainly always a pleasure to have him on the program. Turning our attention over to the livestock sector now. This week we had the opportunity to catch up with University of Nebraska livestock marketing and risk management specialist Elliott Dennis. As always, we had the opportunity to discuss the cattle markets with Elliott, but we began the conversation by looking at the spread of highly pathogenic avian influenza. Let's start out with a conversation about highly pathogenic avian influenza. Haven't really seen many headlines when it comes to that as of late. What can you tell our viewers about that today?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we're not seeing it is because it's really died off. We saw a huge increase in March, April, and really since May and June, we haven't really seen that many cases. We're talking about 15 cases throughout the entire U.S., and most of these have been confined to the layer, nothing here in Nebraska. And so we're really kind of gearing up that May and particularly June might be really poor for the market. And really what we saw is we were able to contain it. I think some of the weather changed, and really we've seen some of those prices stay higher, particularly for eggs. We're at like the $2.88 per dozen. Broiler prices have tended to peak. Turkey prices are much higher, but that's where we felt kind of the largest impact in the South Dakota, Minnesota area. Relative to 2014, 2015, we're at about 40 million head of total birds affected. In comparison, 2014, 2015 was about 50 million. So I think it's great that we've been able to contain it, and I think it's, for the most part, kind of gone away.
Has anything caught your eye about this round of highly pathogenic avian influenza? Anything in particular about the market or just the reaction from U.S. consumers?
I think the biggest thing that I've noticed is that we've been able to see kind of similar incidences in the rates. And the big thing that a lot of people are saying is, hey, I thought we implemented biosecurity, and what happened to all these areas? So I reached out to USDA APHIS, which is their animal health inspection agency. And what they're gathering right now is actually repeat rates of high path. And essentially what they've shown preliminary is only about 20% of all the flocks that have been infected this time are actually got infected in 2014, 2015. The good news in that is that we've been implemented biosecurity, and we just need to continue to push that forward of trying to develop robust across all systems in the U.S.
Let's switch up the conversation a little bit and hit on the cattle market. We've seen some strong momentum, particularly as you and I have this conversation this week, but big picture, your thoughts on the cattle market right now? Yeah,
so when we particularly talk about exports, that seems to be driving a lot of these expectations in the market. We're talking about maybe we're up about 40% almost from January to April of this past year relative to 2021. And if you remember, in 2021, we actually had a really strong export year. And so roughly speaking, that's about $480 per head of export value in that carcass. So even though we feel like we're struggling here in the U.S. with the dollar, there's still a strong demand for U.S. beef, and so far it shows that the export market is willing to pay for it.
conversation we'll have lots here on this week's episode of Market Journal has to do with interest rates, and the Fed had some news that just came out prior to you and I having this conversation. But as they try to kind of put a rope around the U.S. economy to slow the growth down, how do you see that impacting the beef market?
Yeah, so the news you're referring to is the Fed came out about 0.75% interest rate increases, the largest one-time increase in the last 20, 25 years. That's really important because ultimately what that does is it slows growth down, and we know that the product that is most affected by growth in the market is beef. It tends to be a luxury item for a lot of people, and so when we don't have a lot of growth in the market, we tend to see consumers kind of back off on their demand for certain products. I think if you couple that with consumer sentiment, which is at its lowest level since 1978, that would really suggest that consumers are starting to feel that inflation in their pocketbooks. They're starting to be less optimistic about the economy. And of course, as we talk about inflation, more and more people start to become a little bit more concerned. But I think there is a concern by the Fed Reserve and by the market in general that we need to do something to control inflation because it's affecting the markets and ultimately people's ability to expand capacity.
No doubt. So we see the consumer reaction to all this. You said it might lead to a decrease in beef purchases at the store. Business owners also feeling the effects, and that has to do with the packers out there. Heard some news about one packer that said we're not going to be expanding because of this, right?
Yeah, so this is really important because the beef industry and the livestock industry at large during COVID was saying, hey, we need more processing capacity. And so the industry responded to that and said, we are going to build it. And particularly that plant in Tame, Iowa. There's one here in Iowa and in Nebraska that have said that we're going to expand capacity. But they can't do that when it's really expensive to build. And so some of those projects are on hold. So now we have a situation where we want to expand capacity. We have desires to, we have the cattle, or we have the other livestock products, but it's just too expensive. We can't make it cash flow. So that's going to be interesting to see play out and really could pinch the market's ability to continue to expand and meet the export market.
An interesting piece of news came out by Smithfield Foods in regard to one of their production plants in California. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is one of those further things that we talk about, outside sentiment really playing an impact on a business's ability to do business in a certain state. And the Smithfield plant in the LA area decided to basically shut their plant down over really rising costs of doing business there, some of the protesting that was happening there, and really they say it's not a friendly business environment to do. The benefit for us here in Nebraska and people in the Midwest is they said they're going to be looking for places to do business in the Midwest, so potentially recruiting another processing plant here in Nebraska. But ultimately that has implications for where production actually occurs. They have a large sow farm in Utah, which that they're likely going to start kind of dwindling down on those numbers and where those sows end up, hopefully here in Nebraska. But definitely have some implications, at least in the short term, for being able to process.
Interesting story to watch there. We've got just a little bit of time left. Elliott, I want to get your thoughts on some risk management advice back on the topic for our cattle producers today. What can they do to lock in some good margins right now?
Yeah, I think we've noticed, especially this past week, we were talking really high prices right now, and especially if we look at the price differentials between Nebraska and Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. Nebraska certainly has a premium there. Has to largely do with that choice select spread. But we see really summer is that prime market for that choice cattle. But as we mentioned, inflation, we got softening consumer sentiment, potentially softening export demand. All of those would suggest that there's potential to move prices lower. And so I think it's important to talk with your marketing manager, talk as business owners, and think when is it an acceptable margin to lock in those profit for future delivery, and be proactive about managing that risk, recognizing that there's factors outside of production in the beef market that can really impact the demand consumers are willing to pay for product and ultimately the supply of cattle that we bring forward.
Once again, thanks to both Elliott and Darin for their time this week. Next week, I'll be joined by Darin Fessler of Lakefront Futures and Options to discuss the grain trade. If you have any questions you'd like to ask Darin, feel free to get in touch with us using your email or on social media, and I'll be sure to pass those questions along. Joshua Becker, who farms near Beaver City, planted hard red spring wheat this past March. That is his third season of planting spring wheat. With high wheat prices these days, spring wheat may yield less than winter wheat, but it does offer some flexibility when it comes to crop rotation and even has the potential to boost corn yields. You can learn more about spring wheat in the Cornhusker State in the June issue of the Nebraska Farmer. Well, it is now time for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag climatologist and Market Journal's Chief Meteorologist, Al Dutcher. Well, Al, you warned us about the heat, and we did see that earlier in the week. We also saw some more severe storms with damaging hail. Are things going to be a bit calmer as we turn to the week ahead?
Well, Bryce, it's been a pretty wild week. We did have some, unfortunately, some pretty significant severe weather last Saturday, and then, of course, we've seen that big line that developed from Kearney all the way up to the Omaha area, just to the north of the interstate. That dropped some pretty significant wind and, unfortunately, a lot of significant hail. So we've had two major storm events that have in this last 7 days, and of course we've had some other days where we had some scattered thunderstorm activity. We've had a lot of heat that's built up, and of course these higher dew points is just more fuel to the fire, especially when you see a cold front come through and we drop temperature 20 or 30 degrees. Somebody's going to get some severe weather. Now, unfortunately, I wish I could say we're going to stay cool for the next few days. It's been pretty well advertised. We're going to be into a fairly long stretch here of 95 to 105 degree temperatures across the state. And unfortunately, we're going to deal once again with some high humidity due to all the moisture that's fallen to the south of us and, of course, all the moisture to the north of us that's fallen during the spring period. So let's take a look at the upper models and see what we have in store. And the first thing I'll draw your attention is we got this big high pressure centered over the middle part of the country, big trough to our west, and that exiting trough that brought the severe weather to us earlier in the week, moving off the eastern seaboard. High pressure is firmly in place. We're not expecting to see anything in the way of precipitation across the region. We do have a good tropical feed coming up through the central mountains, and eventually that will have an impact on Nebraska. But as we get into Sunday, we'll start to see this trough slowly progressing to our region, and the ridge will slowly move to the east, but that's not going to do anything for temperatures. We're going to still stay consistently high. We see no precipitation in this region, all of it basically moving up through the central Rockies and up over top of the ridge. By the time we get to Monday, this trough starts to lift up towards southern Canada, and we'll see low pressure developing in northwestern portions of Kansas. Unfortunately, the atmosphere is probably going to be capped in regards to precipitation, so we're not going to see much in the way of convection outside of the northern Rockies. And then as we get into Tuesday, that trough starts to move over to the western Great Lakes, and it kind of flattens out the mean flow a little bit. So it's going to allow a little energy to run through to the north of us. But again, with that low pressure in Texas, we still don't have a lot of moisture. We'll watch this area on Tuesday for thunderstorm development. I think we'll see more widespread as we go through the overnight hours into Wednesday, as the broad flow starting to flatten out. So we'll see some quick movement. We're not seeing a lot here on this model because this is the morning model, but really we see the thunderstorm activity that's showing up here. This is kind of the result of the thunderstorms that are expected to develop Tuesday night into Wednesday, and they'll depart the state as we get on Thursday. This high pressure tries to build back in. We get low pressure up in southwestern South Dakota that potentially could generate some more moisture. We'll wait to see. The models are a little bit iffy on that. Major complexes will move across South Dakota, but I wouldn't be surprised we'll see that extend into Nebraska. And then on Friday, we see that zonal flow lifting a little bit toward the north, and we start to see some of that temperature warming back up. But we also will have a low pressure system over northwestern Kansas into north central Kansas that will actually bring some moisture up into the region. And we may start to see some thunderstorm development Friday night and then see this process move across the state as we get into next weekend. So the 8 to 14 day forecast keeps that heat in place. But in terms of precipitation, we do see above normal moisture to our southwest. It would feed in to that zonal flow and moisture to our north. So it does look like we have a decent shot of moisture. Then we warm back up with another shot of pretty significant moisture chances as we get to the last few days of the month, according to the models as we see them today. So overall, enjoy the heat. It's going to be a humid one.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, as we continue into the summer months, you can expect to see more field days at locations near you. One such event, a weed management field day, will be taking place next week. That's June 23rd at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center, which is out in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. This is an early season weed tour that will cover weed control in a variety of crops, including sugar beets and dry edible beans. This event will facilitate a forum to present findings from research being conducted at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center to producers who are interested in attending.
So this is our early season weed tour. So we're going to be covering weed control in mostly sugar beets, corn, a little bit of dry edible beans, a little bit of sunflowers. Some of those crops are planted a bit later, and so the weed differences between treatments might not be as developed as our earlier planted crops. But we're just going to be going over the research we've been doing at the Panhandle Center in Weed Control, and hopefully give some growers suggestions of things they can change or things they can adopt.
While the weather out in the Panhandle has been much cooler and drier than usual, weed emergence was a bit slow to get started this year. However, Neville tells us that it is still important to be on the lookout for any new growth in your fields at the earliest stages of growth.
Scouting is something you can't do too well in weeds. You know, you can scout for a lot of other pests, but weeds they're in the soil, they're hard to find. The probably number one rule I'll say with weed control in crops is going to be use a pre. It's always easier to control weeds as they're germinating than trying to control them when they get bigger. So the earlier you can control those weeds, the better. So really, you're going to focus your weed control program on those pre's, and then you're going to be watching that field to see how those pre's perform, and potentially changing your post options if you need to. And so we're going to start seeing the weeds really come up soon. So now is the time to be on the lookout for if your pre-emergent weed control programs fail, or if you have some weed escapes from potentially resistant species that have shown up in your field that haven't been there before, and to be observant of those early so that you can correct those potentially with your post-emergence options quickly before they get out of hand.
If you are interested in attending this event, again, it'll be held June 23rd, that is a Thursday, at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center out in Scottsbluff. Registration will begin at 8:30 in the morning with the tour beginning at 9 a.m. The event will conclude around noon, and lunch will be provided for attendees. If you would like to learn more about the details of this particular weed management field day, you're encouraged to reach out to Neville personally, and we posted his email below. We've also taken the liberty of posting that information along with this story over on the Market Journal website. Well, that is going to do it for this week's episode. If you happen to miss this story this week, be sure you've downloaded the Market Journal app and you subscribe to Market Journal on YouTube. Here's to a productive and enjoyable week. I'm Bryce Duskett. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.